Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Here's the thing most people miss when they hear about a Supreme Court ruling on redistricting. It sounds technical, almost boring, like some legal housekeeping. But in reality, decisions coming out of the United States Supreme Court can quietly reshape the battlefield where American elections are actually fought. Not by telling voters who to choose, but by shaping the map that decides which choices even matter. And that's why this moment matters. A lot of commentary jumps straight to dramatic conclusions. The rules have been rewritten, this will flip Congress, one party just gained a structural advantage. There's a grain of truth in all of that, but it's also an oversimplification. What's really happening is more subtle, and in some ways more interesting. The rules haven't been replaced, they've been reinterpreted. And that reinterpretation changes how far each side can push the system. To understand why, you have to start with how redistricting works in the United States. Every 10 years, after the census, states redraw their congressional districts. In theory, this is about equal population and fair representation. In practice, it's about power. Whoever controls the state government, legislature, governor, or both, often gets to draw the map. And if you can draw the map, you can influence outcomes before a single vote is cast. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how the system is designed. Now layer on top of that the legal framework, especially the Voting Rights Act. For decades, one key part of that law, Section 2, has been interpreted to mean that states sometimes need to consider race when drawing districts, particularly to ensure that minority voters have a fair chance to elect candidates of their choice. That led to the creation of majority-minority districts, where a racial minority group makes up a majority of voters. But here's where things get complicated. The Constitution also frowns on using race too explicitly in government decisions. So courts have been trying to walk a tightrope for years. You can consider race enough to protect minority voting power, but not so much that it becomes the dominant factor. That balancing act has never been clean or consistent. What the Supreme Court has done in this latest ruling is tighten that balance. Not eliminate race from consideration, but raise the bar. It's now harder to justify drawing districts primarily on racial lines unless there's very strong evidence that it's necessary to prevent discrimination. That sounds abstract, but the consequences are concrete. First, it gives states more flexibility. If you're a state lawmaker drawing a map, you now have more room to argue that your decisions are based on political or geographic factors rather than race. And that matters, because the court has been much more willing to stay out of partisan gerrymandering drawing maps to benefit a political party than racial gerrymandering. Let that sink in for a second. If you draw a district and say, this is about helping Party A win, the court is likely to say that's a political question. But if it looks like you're doing it explicitly based on race, that's where legal trouble starts. So when the legal line on race gets tighter, what often happens in practice is that map makers shift their language and strategy, not necessarily their goals. In other words, the game doesn't stop, it just changes how it's played. That's why it's misleading to say this decision simply hands victory to one party. Yes, in the short term, analysts might estimate that certain districts could flip or that one side could gain an edge in a handful of states. But those projections depend on a chain of assumptions: how states redraw maps, how courts respond, how voters behave, and even how candidates campaign within those new boundaries. Maps matter, but they're not destiny. What's more accurate is to say that this ruling shifts the constraints. It changes the legal environment in which redistricting happens. And in a system where both major parties are already highly strategic, even small shifts in constraints can have ripple effects. Now here's the deeper issue, the one that often gets buried under headlines about which party is winning. The United States has never fully solved the problem of who should draw the maps. Some countries use independent commissions designed to be politically neutral. Some rely on strict mathematical criteria. The US, by contrast, largely leaves it to political actors, with courts stepping in only when something goes too far. That means redistricting is inherently political, even before you get into any specific ruling. So when people say, this decision is unfair, or that map is rigged, they're often reacting to something real, but they're also reacting to a system that was built to allow this kind of conflict, and both parties use it. That's another place where a lot of commentary goes wrong. It frames redistricting as if one side discovered a loophole and the other side is the victim. In reality, Democrats and Republicans have both drawn aggressive maps when they've had the chance. Blue states and red states alike have pushed boundaries, sometimes getting blocked by courts, sometimes not. So, what changes with a Supreme Court ruling like this isn't the existence of partisan strategy, it's the legal language that surrounds it. And that brings us back to the idea that the rules have been rewritten. That phrase is powerful, but it's not quite right. A better way to think about it is this. The field is the same, the players are the same, but the referees just clarified how they're going to call the game. And when that happens, smart teams adjust quickly. If you're a state legislature, you're already asking, how far can we go now? What arguments will hold up in court? How do we design districts that achieve our political goals without crossing the new legal lines? If you're the opposing party, you're asking, where can we challenge these maps? Which cases are worth taking to court? How do we frame our arguments under the updated standards? And if you're a voter, you might not see any of that directly, but you feel the outcome. Your district might look different. Your competitive race might become a safe seat, or vice versa. The candidates who run in your area might change, and with them, the issues that get attention. That's the real impact of redistricting. It doesn't tell you who to vote for. It shapes the environment in which your vote happens. Now, there's another layer to this that's worth paying attention to: timing. We're not talking about some distant, theoretical future. Redistricting decisions feed directly into upcoming election cycles. If states move quickly to redraw maps under new legal guidance, those maps can influence the next round of congressional elections. And because control of the House can hinge on a relatively small number of seats, even modest shifts can matter. But again, this isn't a straight line from court decision to election result. There's legal lag. Maps get challenged. Lower courts issue rulings. Appeals follow. Sometimes, maps are used for one election and then thrown out before the next. It's messy, iterative, and often unpredictable. That's why confident claims about exact seat changes should be taken with caution. They make for good headlines, but they rarely survive the full legal and political process unchanged. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a system that is constantly being renegotiated through legislation, through court rulings, and through political strategy. The Supreme Court plays a crucial role, but it's not acting in a vacuum. Its decisions interact with state governments, with federal law, and with the behavior of both parties. And perhaps most importantly, with public perception, because over time, how people see the legitimacy of the system matters just as much as how the system actually works. If voters start to believe that maps are being manipulated beyond recognition, that can erode trust, even if the underlying processes are technically legal. That's part of what makes these rulings so sensitive. They don't just adjust legal standards, they also signal how the highest court in the country is thinking about fairness, representation, and the role of race and politics in democracy. And those signals get interpreted, debated, and sometimes distorted. So when you hear that a Supreme Court decision has changed the rules, it's worth pausing and asking, changed how? Not in the sense of replacing one system with another, not in the sense of instantly deciding elections, but in the sense of shifting boundaries subtly but meaningfully within a system that was already built for competition. If you zoom out, the bigger story isn't about one ruling or one election cycle. It's about a long-running tension in American democracy, how to balance fairness with political reality, how to protect minority representation without over-relying on race, and how to draw lines on a map in a way that people can accept as legitimate. There's no perfect solution. Every approach has trade-offs. Independent commissions can reduce partisan influence, but they raise questions about accountability. Strict formulas can increase consistency, but they may ignore local realities. Leaving it to legislatures reflects political control, but invites strategic manipulation. The United States has chosen, for better or worse, to live with that tension rather than resolve it completely. And that means decisions like this one don't end the debate, they move it. They change the arguments lawyers make, the strategies politicians use, and the expectations voters have. They open some doors and close others. And over time, those incremental shifts can add up to something significant, not because the rules were rewritten overnight, but because they were adjusted again and again in ways that reshape the landscape. So if you're trying to understand what just happened, don't think of it as a sudden break. Think of it as a continuation of a pattern, a system under constant pressure, a set of rules under constant interpretation, and a political map that is never as neutral as it looks. That's the real story. Thanks for watching.